So good morning everyone, or good evening, or good afternoon. I don't know what time it is now. I hope there are many of you here, because frankly I'm very much alone sitting here, or standing here in front of this machine, and it's a bit sad. But I hope that many of you are here. I'm really looking forward to see what the rest of the day will bring, and thank you so much for Josh and also for Harry for setting it up. And I'm really, really privileged and happy to be opening up. And I want you to learn something today. I really do. In many ways, when we think about design, we think about these predictable patterns that we need to break, they need to go. We think about navigation, we think about the hamburger icon as being the solution, right? We think maybe about carousels, we think about these arrows and the dots, and they're everywhere. But when you start testing, you'll find out that many times, all of the solutions are not necessarily the best ones. And very often, there are better solutions out there. So what I really try to achieve today with the next 45 minutes or so is just bringing a couple of ideas and solutions and techniques, and just to give you a really nice toolbox of different things you can apply to your work right away. And specifically also, kind of moving away from these predictable patterns that we're always using without even thinking twice. But that requires us to really think a little bit about how do we design things, how do we build things, how do we create things. And in many things, we tend to believe that this is a very creative but very linear process where you have a starting point and go. You iterate and refine and improve and improve and keep going until you hit the finish line and you're done. Now, I don't think that the reality looks like this at all, right? Because most of the time you have to work under really tough constraints, like very different constraints. You might end up with things like really strict boundaries in terms of time, in terms of budget, in terms of people, in terms of resources, in terms of legacy, in terms of everything, right? So what we tend to do is not just to create this happy path, right, where we just go from one thing to another because we're creatives, but more like a really tough, constrained, restrictive environment where we have to find a way to make things work, which is difficult, right? Which is also why I think design patterns are extremely important. This is a much more realistic picture of our creative process, where we start somewhere and go, we explore and we diverge and we try to find what works and what doesn't. And every now and again we'll be picking that path, right, and we'll be moving on, but then eventually we'll be hitting that dead end again, and we have to come back and move forward because we have to hit the finish line at some point. We have deadlines coming up, right? And so I think in many ways this is exactly these points, right, these dead ends, is where design patterns are extremely helpful, right? Not because we can just take a couple of off-the-shelf components and call it a day, right? But because they're kind of good starting points for us to really make better and more informed design decisions. And it also helps us to boost the process along the way. And so I think that in many ways, when I start designing today, it's really a good idea to think about how we can design in a more predictable way, but still bringing our creativity into our design solutions, because we don't want to end up with this. We've seen this a couple of years ago now, right? Is it a good thing if we rely on design patterns, we end up with the same thing repeated over and over and over? Which one of these two possible websites are you designing today? The one on the left or the one on the right? Because there is nothing else, right? Well, in reality it's not like you have to design everything in the same way. But there are certain design decisions that you can actually base your decision upon to make the results better. And that's exactly what I want to cover today. Now, with this in mind, let's look into some of those. And specifically, I think a very important one is the notion of navigation. When we think about navigation, we think about the bar at the top, and maybe on the left, maybe on the right, right? But a very predictable set of links or buttons or mega drop-downs. But the navigation could be anything. Right? This is Institut Français de la Mode, right? And everything is a little bit different here, maybe off, right? Maybe not everybody would come up with a design like this on spot, right? The grid is a bit strange. Look at this menu button and programs. Can you spot the height of that program's menu section thing? Exactly, it's 182 pixels or so, right? And it's original size, it's not increased in size or so. Is the good thing or is the bad thing? It's like a navigation is taking up such a prominent space. And we like to hide navigation, right? Hide it away behind the hamburger icon at call today. Well, maybe exposing isn't a bad thing at all. When I was testing it, nobody had problems with it at all. It felt like it's really easy to use, everything is obvious, the buttons are huge, it's really easy to tap, it's easy to click, it's easy to navigate. Great design, there is no problem there at all, right? Here's another example from Point Campus from Ireland, where half of the entire layout on desktop is dedicated to the navigation. Is the good thing, is the bad thing? Well, maybe the navigation is actually faster when you actually have the navigation displayed right there next to the actual content, right? It doesn't mean that it's better or worse, right? So it's really up for us to decide what works and what doesn't. Now, usually this navigation, all of the navigation gets hidden away on mobile, right? That's not surprising. Behind a hamburger icon, not really a hamburger icon, we have a family of hamburger icons, so you choose your own flavor, right? So here we have so many options. You can choose anything from kebab to veggie burger to cake and stairs and fries and strawberry. You choose your own adventure if you like. But of course, if you start looking around, you'll find that some sort of hamburger icon, right, and usually like just 3 lines, is everywhere, right? So you go to Georgian websites, you find this navigation and hamburger icons in there. You go to news websites in India and you find it there as well. You go to Israel and you find them in Hebrew too. The hamburger icon per se is becoming, or has become, a standard, of course. We did have discussions about menu button versus hamburger icon. It seems like most of the time, it will be a hamburger icon these days. But yet sometimes these icons look a bit different, or sometimes they work a bit differently as well. We've seen this trend happening for quite a while now, that the navigation is appearing at the bottom because it's actually more accessible for the thumb or the index finger as well, right? Just easier to tap. Well, mostly for the thumb, right? And so the navigation sometimes is happening, bottom up instead of coming from top to bottom. In the same way, sometimes it's not necessarily an overlay. It could be just, taking up the entire screen and then, into this kind of experience. And sometimes it's just broken down into parts. You might have some important things highlighted at the bottom, right? And then some other things, which are kind of maybe secondary in nature, are living in the hamburger icon in the right upper corner. And also sometimes you have this floating bar, which gives you access to all the other navigation options as well, right? So again, the hamburger icon comes in all kind of different flavors, so to say. But when you start testing it, you'll find that there are certain things that keep appearing all the time. And this is very visible on StarWars.com, where there is a distance between the initial click and the secondary click when you actually want to restore the action or undo the action. That's actually quite common because in some websites, you go to a website, you click on the hamburger icon, the menu shows up, and you kind of instinctively sometimes click on the same spot to close it. But sometimes it doesn't close, but drives you to a section. And in that case, in this case, at StarWars.com, it actually drives you to the sign up section or login page, because you don't really see what you clicked, right, when you tapped on it. And it's also visible in, places everywhere, really, both on mobile and on desktop. On mobile, it's actually more typical, which just introduces this an unneeded friction, right, unneeded time that's required to reposition your finger or reposition your mouse in order to tap somewhere. And on TQ, it's actually happening on desktop, where we look at this space that's needed in order to close that button, and it's just not necessary to really introduce this distance. It just doesn't make sense. So instead, just make sure that whenever somebody can click on the hamburger icon, they can also click on the same spot and close it. And there are very simple ideas, like very simple decisions you can make here. There is nothing groundbreaking here. You tap again, you close. That's it. Or if you want it to be a bit more interesting, it could be like a tab bar or so, where you have the sections appearing there as well, right? Or it could even be applied to things like filters, right? When you tap on a filter, you can close the filter there as well, right? At the same spot. However, one of the things that kind of appears with hamburger icon is the fact that we hide too much stuff in there. Whenever you have a basement, right, and there are certain important things in your room, in your apartment, you probably don't put your important things in the basement, and in some way the hamburger navigation has become a basement for us, right? We just put everywhere in there and hope for the best. But if you have a critical actions, like critical CTAs or whatever, like login and sign up and download the app, just show them instead of actually showing them on tap when the hamburger icon is activated, right? And again, remember, whenever you open, you should be able to close right away as well. It goes the same for everything that can be undone, right? Like here on Volta, on the lightbox, you tap on an image to see it bigger, and then very often you have to actually hide it, kind of find it as it's chasing away and running somewhere in the right upper corner. You tap on the same spot and you can close it right there. That's a little bit faster, right? That's a little bit better. And of course, one common thing that has been happening lately, because it's really a good idea to show navigation instead of just hiding it. What if we try to find a way to show navigation, right? Just remove hamburger icon altogether, like we see on MoMA, where you have this navigation kind of placed where the critical actions are tickets and members, I guess. Then you have arbitered, where they show as much as they can, and then you click on the menu button, and then you actually get to see more, right? Or here on typography.com, where they have slightly different structure and have different sections, and as you go to fonts, for example, you're actually going to see some of the subsections in fonts when you tap on them, right? Kind of really exploring the navigation instead of hiding things behind the hamburger icon, right? Kind of makes sense. Why would you actually hide important things? And actually, it's really connected to data as well, because if you look into some research, you'll find out that actually showing navigation is a really good thing. So Luke Wroblewski gave an incredible talk 1.5 years ago, or so I think now. And he actually was looking specifically into the reasons why we actually hide navigation, why most of the time when we go into e-commerce experiences, right, and most of the time it's just newsletter promo and then app install banner, right? And of course, the first thing we do is closing both of them, and only then we see navigation. But what if we actually try to test if showing navigation is better than hiding it, right? Because there is some data that proves that it's actually probably a good idea. So here's a study from Growthrock where they actually tested exactly that, and they saw that just by removing things from a hamburger icon and exposing it right here at the top as a carousel actually increases completed orders by 5%. They tested it on a different vertical and they had the same experience with 29% increase in completed orders, right? Here another test on Edgar's, kind of similar story as well, where instead of showing a shop gift guide promo, they just show some navigation. And what they see is 13% increase in revenue per visitor, right? Quite remarkable. And so most of the time when we think about, hiding things behind a hamburger icon, we really should be thinking about what impact does it have on business KPIs, right? We might, of course, get more subscriptions to newsletter and things like that, right? But at the same time, it might hurt conversion dramatically. So that's something that we shouldn't be forgetting. Or even little things, like if you think about search, it's very common for us to just have a search icon and then you tap on search icon and then you show the search bar, right? But it might be a good idea to actually show it and expose it. Because every time you have something that's important, you should not be hiding it away. Again, the same way, like if you have something that's really critical and that really is being used a lot, you will not hide it behind in a closet somewhere where it's really difficult to reach. Because we have data again, Matalan. They just display the search bar to test if there are more mobile searches coming in. And of course, if you expose a search bar, you should be expecting more people searching on mobile. They saw 32% increase in searches on mobile. So all of this just to say, essentially, every time we think about displaying navigation or hiding navigation, we really should be thinking twice of what impact it actually has, right? But it also depends on how much navigation we display. Right? One of the things that we always do is try to prioritize and think about what matters and what doesn't matter. Or maybe matters a bit less, right? And it's especially important for mega dropdowns. Here in the Royal Institution, there is a lot of navigation going on, right? And it's very common for really complex navigation like this to have this sliding effect, kind of move back and forward, and you can go up to 4 nested levels deep, right? The problem is that you really have to be very clear about where the user is and where, how to come back and other things. And so maybe it's actually a little bit better to really think twice about how to design it, right? One of the ways to do it, and it's a really easy, really straightforward, a simple way, is to have some visual contrast, of course, but also at the same time, try to highlight maybe slightly different things. So as you type on menu or click on menu, you actually show how many sections are available in there. You tap on one of them, it actually gets a bit smaller. You can always come back to the previous one, right? So at least there is a little bit of visual contrast going on here. And then if there is no number anymore, which could indicate the number of products, of course, as well, then you know that is actually the link to the section. But you can do it even better, where you can say, well, maybe let's just use some sort of indentation, right, or so. So you tap on one of the options, you have nested accordions, and you indent, indent, indent. So instead of sliding horizontally back and forth, which is slow, you actually navigate vertically, which is, you know, reasonable. Or even better, here on Allianz, very corporate, of course, but you tap on one of the sections, it gets highlighted, it's very clear what it is, and then you have a subsection which is in bold, and then you have the third section which is just regular, and then there is also a link to see all subsections, right? Just a slightly better structure, and I think in many ways much, much better than having this sliding effect going on, right? Sometimes you don't even need it, to be honest. So this is lcfc, right, .com, and here they also have quite a bit of navigation going on stuff here, but they can kind of show everything at all times. So if you can do that too, you just split the screen horizontally and you show the sub-level right there. Maybe it's actually a bit better than just having, again, sliding left and right all the time. There are two interesting things that have been happening lately, and that's the fact that many of us apparently are moving away from showing drop-downs on hover, right, towards showing the menu on tap, on click, but then also closing the menu also only on tap, on click, giving users a bit more control about how things are displayed, right? Which is a bit more calm, and you don't get irritated all the time by things opening and closing without your consent, right? So that's a little bit better. Another interesting pattern is this, you know, show me what I can do pattern, where the idea really is to let customers construct their own navigation query. So let them choose what they want to learn, right? Or let them choose what their position is, or things like that. Essentially just a couple of drop-downs or accordions where they can literally select what they want, and then they're driven to that particular page that's really corresponds to that particular query. Here's another case for this from Cork Chamber, kind of very similar. So as you tap at the top, let's go back here. As you tap at the top, you can choose, I want to take a training course, I want to book an event, I want to go international, I want to browse member directory, right? Really user-focused in many ways, and really maybe actually a little bit more helpful than just, you know, showing regular navigation instead, right? So there are many things that we might want to consider. At Smashing, of course, we're also looking into improving things, and one of the things that we've been playing with is this notion of how can we make our navigation a bit more better and expose all content there, because right now we're just showing a hamburger icon and that's really it. So we started thinking, and again, it's a matter of priorities, right? Some things are more important than others. So, you know, here we know that articles and topics are important, and we want to keep them all times, right? But then we also want to keep membership at all times. That's very important for us. But then these things, well, we can hide them one by one. It's kind of really, once you define the priorities, you know these things have to be displayed, and this thing can be displayed later, right? And so this is what we ended up with. You know, you click on the menu of the cat, and I'm very proud of this. You get to see the cat chasing, and you display everything. But then you tap on the same spot to open and close, right? As you probably have noticed. Now, what can we do with navigation then? Just to sum up and recap a little bit. Well, first of all, you need to be very clear about the priorities. What is important to you? What do you want to highlight? What do you want to prioritize? Once you know what you want to prioritize, never hide that important part. If you have time and space, consider splitting navigation vertically for submenus. You might not need more than 2 levels of navigation, really, unless it's something like very specific, like medical equipment, for example, or with reference numbers and things like that. But then maybe it's a better idea to invest quite a bit of money and time into good autocomplete search, right? Maybe some filters that might work a bit better, as you know, construct your own query kind of thing. We know that, you know, the things at the bottom, the tabs, the buttons, the links actually work better at the bottom because they're accessible, more accessible, easier accessible for the thumb. So consider placing them there. Display as much as you can, right? Essentially, this is the main goal there. And then collapse navigation when it makes sense. So it's maybe a floating bar at the top or at the bottom. It's really up to you. But it's actually visible. But always test it, right? Because sometimes it can be very, very annoying, and sometimes it's exactly what people are looking for, depending on what it is, of course, right? So that's navigation. Now, of course, we haven't covered one beast that we need to cover because everybody hates it and I love him. Carousels. Anybody hates carousels yet? Well, maybe I'll make you fall in love with carousels because they did nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong in a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful carousel like this. However, frankly, sometimes they just don't look great. So this is a very traditional, common pattern for us to use in a carousel. Have an arrow pointing to the left, arrow pointing to the right, and then a few dots in between. Well, frankly, when you look in the data, most of the time they will not be performing fairly well, right? And the reason for it is very simple. Why would you want to click on the second, third, and fourth dots or the arrows? This is the data that shows the click-through rate for this particular site. It's actually quite old now, but it shows two interesting patterns, which you will also find in usability test. Number one, not many people click through the carousel, right? Number two, when somebody actually does click on position 2, they probably will click on position 3, and they might click on position 4. Kind of want to make the full circle, unless there are like hundreds of those images, right? And there is a good reason why these carousels work fairly well in product pages with product images, and also in things like news websites where you have a big gallery of things, right? But the question is, how can we make these carousels a bit better? Because this is maybe not the ideal pattern for it. Well, if you start exploring, you'll find really interesting examples. When I was in Istanbul a while back, I was really exploring the world of carousels in Turkey. And I was quite impressed because, they look very different compared to what we're used to, right? There is no dots. No, there is no dots. Most of the time there will be numbers, although sometimes there will be these traditional sliders with dots as well, but this is a rarity, so to say. And I'm really happy that you're asking, by the way, what it would look like on mobile. On mobile, they would have a lot of dots, right? Which is, just dots, really. And these numbers, really, most of the time, are on every single news website. And this is probably the best example I could find, which is just a gallery of all kind of things that you can do on, with a carousel. So you have the horizontal one, and you have a vertical one, and you have one with thumbnail, and you have one with, content slider as well, right? But they do not have to look like this most of the time. This is one from Russia. And in here, they use this metaphor of a bookshelf with books being on the bookshelf, right? And as you swipe left and right, and as you move in between, kind of have this book popping up. You maybe want to tilt it, maybe so it's a little bit more readable. But in the end, this is still a carousel, but it's a very engaging carousel. I really love it, right? Here's another one from Teatr Lalka in Poland. Probably the best cookie consent pop-up I've seen in my life, by the way. But this is a puppet theater. And as a puppet theater, they use this metaphor of a puppet theater in the carousel as well. So you can swipe left and right and you get to explore and play with these characters. It kind of fits well within the story. It's really nice. But then as you actually go to the menu, right, it's actually similar as well, right? It's beautiful. It's just really well designed and it just fits within the story. So the carousel, if it does fit within your story, can work magic, right? Even in the corporate setting. So this is one from INRA, Science and Impact, and they're using this metaphor of a DNA for you to browse through those things, and they even have some filters going on, and the arrows are kind of contextually positioned. Sometimes they're in the upper right corner, sometimes they're on the left, right? And it's a slightly different carousel, although of course it is still a carousel, right? Now, there are also other patterns. If you feel like this is totally out of control, this is not my world at all, well, make a carousel a bit easier to navigate. This is a very simple example of this, where you have these options like 4 or 5 or 6, and then instead of having the dots, replace it with 1 out of 5, 2 out of 5, and so on. So people can only click on the arrows to navigate it, or swipe left and right, of course. We often forget about these arrows actually, and just have very tiny arrows and maybe very tiny dots. But many people will be focusing on the arrows, so make them bigger. And maybe if you have the opportunity, make it a bit more interesting, right? Again, maybe highlight how many options there are, but also this kind of background effect might be really, really cool to show and highlight, and then combined with a testimonial. Looks really nice. There is nothing wrong about a carousel like this at all. Although sometimes it's not enough, I get that. So you might want to do a bit more. You go and maybe you have some sections you want to highlight. But the idea is, what if every single dot would be a bit more meaningful, right? Replace a dot with something that's a little bit more contextual, right? Maybe an icon, maybe a label, anything of that kind. So there is a reason for people to actually dive through it and kind of look through it, right? And most of the time when you look around, that can be interesting. So here's a really beautiful carousel which is auto-playing, right? Auto-playing carousels, everybody hates them. I love them if they fit within the story. So this is you being really exposed to all the diversity of products that this particular company has to offer, or design agency has to offer, right? It's auto-playing, and it's using this metaphor of a clock, I guess, and it kind of works really well. You can make it a bit better by having a label next to each of these dots, right? Circular carousel here, so you can tap to them a little bit faster, right? Which kind of works fairly well as well. But really impactful, full visual background, carousel, which works very well, right? Now on Amazon, of course, they decided to replace the dots with something that's a bit more contextual. So you don't get, these little dots and the little arrow. Instead, every dot is becoming more like a tab, which has a thumbnail and it has a text and has a buy copy here as well, if you look around, right? It's also auto-playing, right? But then you kind of get the sense of what to expect next, right? They don't do that on mobile though, because on mobile, instead of showing the dots, they show navigation, we talked about already, and also this little thing that you can swipe left and right, right? And again, very important, they do not show the dots, because many people will be focusing on the dots to navigate it, right? Which is just unneeded. Now, we can use carousels. There is nothing wrong about them per se, but we have to be a bit careful because we need to choose a sequence of slides carefully. The ones that are coming in later in the carousel will be seen less, so show the important ones. And particularly think about what would be the reason for people to go to the second slice of a carousel when they see the first, right? That's where you can move them to go through the entire thing. Most important slides should be coming first. They should not rotate too quickly. That's very important. Because otherwise they're distracting, people start ignoring them, and especially you can see it on mobile. Whenever you see slides rotating too quickly, people will be scrolling fast, really, really fast down to avoid the carousel altogether, and this is, you lost your chance, right? Try to avoid auto-rotation on mobile altogether. Always support swipe gestures, show a slice of a following slide, like we saw in Amazon example, right? And provide information sent for available slides, like maybe show that there is something in there, so people can see, that there is something available. And carousels work fairly well as an image gallery and also on product pages, so there is no really a reason to kill them, right? Which brings us to something that's related to carousels, but it's a little bit different: the sliders. Also often forgotten and also often neglected and kind of avoided, and unrightfully so. So let's fix that. Now, sliders. What's the big deal with sliders? When we think about a slider, we think about something that looks pretty much like this, right? So you have a slider, you have a thumb, you have a track, you have some value, and then you can operate it and you can move back and forth, right? In reality, though, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because there are certain scenarios where sliders are really difficult to use. So if you look in here, sliders are often used as filters, right? When we want to explore many options. And so here they are right there, but you can almost sense that pain point that people have when they want to move or change the values just slightly, right? Not, a lot, but just slightly. If you want to change the takeoff time from Wednesday 4 a.m. to, let's say, 5:30 a.m., this is going to be painful. It really will be painful, right? So this is where it's really, really difficult. So we want to use sliders so people can explore many options very quickly, but sliders are really bad when it comes to being precise. So let's fix that once and for all. Because in reality, there are many reasons why sliders are not, working, right? Now, first of all, you'll find them in a lot of corporate settings, right? Whenever we want to explore maybe things like affordability, a mortgage calculator, things like that, they'll be used quite a bit in order to be able to adjust your personal plan or pricing, often combined with filters, often combined with input fields, right? Then you're kind of playing with it, so to say, in order to explore what your best options are, right? The same goes over here, where you also have a down payment and other things. In financial institutions, we'll find them quite a lot. Yet very often they're used in the wrong way. So here's one, and essentially there are a couple of things that are wrong. And one of them is that we don't have that many options, so we probably don't even need a slider here. We have 3 options on the top, 2 options in the middle, and then 4 options at the bottom, right? And then you end up with this really weird thing where, why would you actually have a slider with a dot where the part of the track that's actually coming after the thumb will be covered? That just doesn't make sense, because what really sliders are showing, or the thumb is showing, is the maximum value, not just a maximum value. So this cannot be right? And in fact, if you have 3 options, maybe having some sort of just a couple of radio buttons, or buttons really, would be a bit better. On the other hand, our sliders always show a sense of progression. So we start here, and yes, 200 megabit includes 50, and 500 includes 200, but it's not necessarily the case over here, where they're just slightly distinct products altogether, right? So again, we have to really think twice about when slider makes sense and when not. On the other hand, we use sliders most of the time when we want to be very fast. We want people to explore things and explore the options very quickly. But some sliders would actually let us down. You want to be faster, but then you end up being slowed down. Why? Well, because as we see here, as you move the thumb across the track, the value that you actually want to see, this is the point where you interact with it, doesn't change unless you drop the thumb, right? Which is essentially us being slowed down, really being slowed down, right? And then there are also all kind of scenarios like this. Imagine you have some sort of a filter at the top left, and then you have 1979 and 2006. Now what happens if you click right in the middle, right? What should happen? Can you guess? Well, in that case, either the left one is going to go right, or the right one is going to go left, right? Because it's a range. Well, sometimes it's just, 1 year is going to be selected. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And it's really impossible to get out of this actually anymore. Luckily, there are presets you can play with, right? So all these patterns are kind of appearing, quite frequently, and we need to solve them. Now, how can we solve them? Well, there are a couple of really straightforward ways of doing so. First of all, we need kind of a big grip, right? So whenever you tap on a thumb, you can comfortably move it around. And it doesn't mean that the slider has to be horizontal or vertical. It can also be circular, like it's done here on Google Sustainability, right? Where as you move it across the circle, it actually, really easy to grab. Look at the thumb, it's really huge. And at the same time, you also have the steppers, where you can move step by step, right? By using these arrows, right? And it's kind of really easy. Like if you look into the padding area, it's really easy to kind of move it around, right? Which is not common for most of them. So big tapping area is great. Another thing you can do is to make them a bit more approachable, so people don't have empty results, right? So Airbnb has been using a histogram on a slider for many years now, actually, and you can use it as well, right? For all kind of information, like let's say pricing, if you maybe have a particular pricing range, where you have some products which are available or not available, you can actually show distribution of your prices as well. But another thing you can do is to really enable people to move at the pace that's most comfortable for them. And what it means really, if the people want to explore many options very quickly, let them use the thumb and move it around, right? However, if they want to have a slightly slower, more predictable pace, well, have the minus and the plus buttons so you can actually move in predictable steps. And they want to be very specific, right? Have the input field as a fallback as well, right? 3 different paces, which are really working well, because at the end, you can choose, right? You're really fast in exploring things, or you're really, really precise in, providing things or typing things in. So these three options are great, but you can also combine them together into one. As it's done here on Gothenburg Energy in Sweden, where you can calculate how much energy you're going to use at home. And so you can, move the thing across the thumb, and it really responds beautifully to your input. But then, at any point of time, if you want to, you can jump. How do you jump? Well, basically you jump by tapping or clicking. Oops, let's go back. By clicking on that actual area where the number is presented, right? Maybe it could be a little bit more obvious. Let's go back up. Can I see this? Right? So as you tap in there, you can just jump to any value you like by just typing things in, right? Again, a bit more predictable and a bit easier to navigate, right? So in that regard, it's actually really, really brilliant. So with sliders, they're great when there are many options. They encourage exploration, not precision. However, they always, because sliders are usually horizontal, so they always need horizontal space. Think about the track, the thumb, the padding, display outcome in real time. That's very important. Most of the time it's not done this way, right? Think about having a text input fallback and steppers to move back and forth predictably. Now we've covered quite a bit of stuff already, but one important thing that we should not forget, because it's again very much, could be done a bit better most of the time, is forms, right? And forms are really, really important, and there are so many decisions that have to be made to get to a successful completion of a form, because forms are everywhere, and most of the time they look pretty much like this. We're kind of replicating the forms from 80s, 70s, 60s or so. We have radio buttons and we have slightly different width, kind of indicating how much space we need to fill in a thing, right? And then you have essentially just a couple of boxes, and you fill them in, and essentially that's it. But forms are everywhere. It doesn't matter where you look, every time you need some action, be it search or filtering or dashboards or newsletters or online transactions, application forms, authentication, onboarding, tables, anything really, you will end up with a form. And usually they do not look very nice. Now this is a nice one. This is from gov.uk, probably one of my favorite form designs ever, really. We have really large buttons, it's fully accessible, and it's really, really well designed, it's beautiful. Sometimes it's used as a combination and they're nested, and you end up with checkboxes and drop downs with nested things and stuff going on there as well. Sometimes just really, 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 really huge select drop downs, which could be a little bit frustrating at times, especially if you need to find something very, very specific. You need to scroll all the way. Sometimes just a bit weird, I would say. This is one of them, where the form is asking you how many children you have, using this weird calculator kind of thing, I guess. And then here we have a question, do you have children? Where the answer is presented, as you will see in a moment, with a slider, right? And in fact, that slider actually has a value and a pencil, and it's a little bit weird, maybe, right? So, they're just a bit weird. Sometimes just boring. You have a very long form and you have so many fields to fill in, and sometimes very, very, very boring, and sometimes just frustrating. This is one we have to apply for passport for visa to UK. For a long time, what you had to do there, not only is wonderful fancy select drop downs in here, but you actually had to type in the exact values you had on your passport in here, including the weird symbols as it's actually explained at the top. So let's take a look at some of the typical things that go wrong with forms and see how we can make them a little bit better. And one important thing to understand there is that when you think about forms and data input in general, we tend to believe that people are kind of used to very predictable patterns like first name, middle name, last name, right? But in the end, we should be probably replicating the way of how people think or imagine input types. So whenever somebody asks you for your name, well, you will not say my first name is Alex and my second name is, or my last name is Mitchell, right? You say my name is Alex Mitchell, right? This is just how it works, right? We just give the full name. Same goes for address. It's not like when you ask for address, you're being asked for address. It's not like you're going to say my street is this, my building number is that, my apartment is this, my unit building is this, my floor is that, my state county is this, and my zip postcode is that, and city is this, and country is that. Just not how it works. Instead, we're just giving this full, complete structure or detail of our address. The same goes for credit card and passport and login and things like time, data input, phone number, zip postal code, and so on, right? Now, obviously, with credit card, it's a bit different because it's broken down into pieces, right? But still, we kind of see it as a unity, as an entity, solid, single entity that we're being asked for, right? And so we shouldn't break these patterns, right? And in many ways, we really should be asking not only what is the best way to ask for a certain thing, but also what is the right time to ask for a specific thing. Like, how often do you see things like, please confirm your email, or please confirm your password? And I'm wondering sometimes why you don't have to confirm your first name or last name or middle name as well, right? What would be the right time to ask somebody to confirm or verify the email? What would be the right time to ask somebody to verify the password? What would be the right time to ask for location permission or to move somebody in the funnel, right? What is the minimum required for somebody to really get started so we can actually ask all these questions a bit later, right? This is why we started looking at things like input budgets recently, where the idea is to think about how do we speed things up, right? We still know that typing on mobile isn't very accurate, so maybe instead we can say let's prefer large buttons and toggles and sliders. When people type and text input, we need to make sure they're staying on the keyboard, so they have a comfortable keyboard, they don't have to switch it, and probably use autocomplete, then also smart defaults for giving input and things like that. And also things like persisting the data upon refresh, which is often forgotten, right? But then we also have to figure out what is the time needed to complete a form. Often forgotten, right? Let's measure completion time with the minimum number of taps required for the entire form to be submitted, the minimum number of taps on mobile. At the same time, let's measure the complexity of a form with the maximum number of input fields per step, right? Usually we would say, maybe 7 on mobile, could be a little bit more on desktop. But once you have these measures in place, you can actually much more comfortably make decisions about how the form should look like, right? And let's just take a look at some of the examples to make sure it's really obvious. One of them is, we talked about it already, radio buttons. Radio buttons should be round because they're radio buttons. And they're great because they expose, they make options easy to compare and scan and select. There's nothing wrong with them. But they're not suitable when there is that too many options. And very often they're restrictive. So usually we need another option as a fallback. Think about gender, it's male, female, and something like I'd rather not say, or any other third option, right? But they fit well only for mutually exclusive options. So if we look into this example here, where we have remote friendly, it's actually not a radio button, it's more checkbox, but then checkboxes should not be round, they should be squared. That's just a convention that we've been used for years, right? They're great as quick filters and tags and to toggling things in between, and they fit well for mutually non-exclusive options, unlike radio buttons, right? So that's just, had to be said. It's very annoying when checked by default or small in size, right? As we know from subscription newsletters boxes, but this is just something that we can keep in mind. On another hand, we often use select drop-downs, and select drop-downs are, they may be not necessarily the best idea really to use. So whenever it comes to select drop-downs, they're just a little bit slower, really slower compared to toggles or buttons or things like that. So Luke Wroblewski wrote a while back that drop-downs should be the UI of last resort. And it's a good idea to avoid select drop-downs as far as possible. He was talking about native select drop-downs, select boxes. Of course, if you combine them with autocomplete, it actually makes sense. It's a bit better. And in fact, they're really slow because you have to tap the control, then scroll, usually more than once, then find your target, and then finally move on, right? So this is why it's probably a good idea if you have an interface which requires some select drop-downs, think about what else you could use, right? Maybe you could use a switch. When you have recently sold items and you have only 2 options, show and hide, use a switch instead. Or if it's a range, we talked about it already, then use a slider. Or when it comes to a number of bedrooms, for example, or a number of passengers, use steppers or segmented controls to be able to navigate predictably, right? Or buttons. Buttons are great. I really like buttons, right? Or again, steppers, which are just a little bit faster. So in many ways, drop-downs they have issues. Sometimes users will try to type into them to jump instead of scrolling. They confuse focused options with selected ones. They often confuse them with autocorrect. But at the same way, we kind of prevent local informatic differences and errors, which is why we can kind of use select drop-downs in combination with autocomplete, right? In fact, this is where they kind of make sense, right? Let me just jump over here quickly. Like for example in here, right, where you start typing and then you are pre-filling whatever it is, whatever the address is. Could also be used for things like email. Right? When you start typing and then you identify or try to understand if that input that you have, if that actually something that could be corrected, so you can look into common emails or email providers that you're using and just prevent people from making mistakes. And so actually really autocomplete is marrying a flexibility of a text box with assurance of a select box. So if you can avoid the select box and use autocomplete instead, that's probably a good idea to do so, right? Again, just something that's sometimes actually causes quite a bit of a trouble. Now, whenever it comes to designing a form, it's probably a good idea to think twice about how you design it. And this is where you kind of just go step by step through every single input field and try to define its profile, right? Maybe it's a couple of things. It could be minimum length and maximum length, and what characters do you allow? Is it mandatory or is it optional? Do you want to pre-fill it or not? Do you want to auto-capitalize it or not? Things like that. On the other hand, you can also go quite far by saying, do you need validation? Do you need accessible tooltip or hint or things like that? And so essentially, it's a really good idea to go step by step through every single form, kind of create some sort of profile on each of them. Right? That's quite important. And in fact, very often you can actually ask for the address and the zip code first, and then pre-fill things based on that. Because once you know them, you can actually make some good decisions, like here on Grace, right? When you start typing it in, and there is a form that you want to fill in, right? And then as you keep going, you start typing, and then you essentially get to where you want to go with an address lookup. Again, honestly, one of the things that's often forgotten, and unrightfully so. You can do it even better, because for a long time we had this problem where things were not as precise, and the databases were not as precise. But why don't you let your customers not only type in a predictable way using autocomplete, but also at the same time type whatever they want, right? Locate is a really nice library, a really nice tool, a service, which allows you to just type whatever you want, like you can see in the right hand here, right? And then essentially you try to parse it and understand it, and then it actually outputs a really reasonable, very structured, well-structured data set where everything is filled in a way you like. Again, think about the solid entities that we thought about previously, right? There are also other things that you can use. Algolia Places is one of them, and Place Autocompleted is another one from Google as well, right? And then finally, one thing that I think we really need to put more attention on is how we're dealing with things like inline autocomplete. Oh, sorry, like inline validation, right? Because there are really three kinds of validation: the premature validation, the immediate validation, and late validation. Now, what's the difference? Well, premature happens when you actually just focus on the input field. Like showing an error there just doesn't make sense. Immediate validation is when we're typing, but then of course it could be that as you're typing your email address, just before you type the @ symbol, you're already getting an error message, which is a little bit too early because you haven't typed in the full email address yet. But then of course there is a late validation, so user has left the field, and then on blur we actually show an error when it's already too late. So all these options are not really great because they either interrupt users too early or too late. And here they're in action, right? On Google Answers, or Google Forms really, you start typing your email address, and just even before you start, you end up with premature validation, which is not really great. Here on Apple, right, you start typing and you keep typing, and you actually don't get any feedback unless you move on to the next input field, which is actually a little bit too late. So how can we deal with it? Well, in fact, you can use a very simple technique. You can say for every input, let's set a minimum threshold of characters, and we're going to bring up an error message only if that threshold is passed. So we start validating only when the threshold is reached. If there is an error, we show it immediately as we detect it. If you have some really weird string of characters that cannot be in an email, you inform your customers right away. Then you show success only if the user has moved to the next input field. But then, of course, you have situations where there might be a mistake and there might be valid input or invalid input. And here's the idea is coming from Mikhail Konjevich, who wrote an article about rewarding early and punishing late, right? But we reward people early when, meaning that when the editor field that was valid, we validate after data entry, right? So after they move to the next input field. But when the input field was invalid and somebody is trying to fix it, right, we actually validate during data entry, right? So as you are fixing, you will be getting a notification that it's right away. But if the input was valid already and you want to adjust things, you actually validate after data entry, right? Just very common things that are often getting forgotten, right? And the same goes for error messages, because with an error messages, whenever there is a problem, we kind of need to be really, really clear about it and explain it, right? And there are many different ways of how we can explain it. We often forget to include a summary as well as highlight the errors where they happen. And so, with some sort of a section where you can jump right there. Imagine you're clicking on the submit button and you could show a pop-up maybe above the submit button, letting people jump straight to that first error, or maybe even highlighting the summary of what went wrong, right? And finally, two more things and then I'm finished. Very often we see this pattern where we actually cannot click add to cart or you cannot click checkout button until you fill in all the form input fields correctly. So essentially disabling submit buttons, right? Hoping that people will find it and they will actually correct all the input first. Well, the problem with it is that while disabling submit buttons, we don't really explain what is wrong, right? Sometimes users are left wondering what's missing and they're not focusable and hard to read as they're grayed out. With enable buttons, we actually get an opportunity or a chance to explain to somebody what is wrong or what was wrong. So maybe instead of disabling the submit button, prompt something like allow people to click on them and then highlight errors right there. And the same actually goes for things like, undo on confirmation dialogues. So it's become very common for critical actions that whenever you click on, do you want to delete this thing, that you actually have to type in the repository or type in delete to delete something, right? And sometimes it makes sense, but very often it can be very frustrating as you're using the interface more and more often, right? And in fact, one way of dealing with it would be to say, well, maybe let people delete, but then at the same time, without creating confirmation dialogues, make sure that they can actually restore the initial state of things. So for critical actions, for example, deleting an item, you might need to provide an option to confirm before the action is made and undo once it has been made. It's fine to have both, but very often it might be that the confirmation itself is not needed, especially if the task is not that difficult, right, or not that critical, right? And so think next time whenever you have some sort of confirmation dialog, think if there is a way to just restore it or let users restore it instead. Because in the end, confirmation prompts they kind of question users' intent, while undo is actually respected, right? And there's a really nice quote by Alan Cooper in About Face where he wrote that for confirmation dialog boxes to work, they must only appear when a user will almost definitely click the no or cancel button. And it should never happen when a user is likely to click the yes or OK button, right? Now, when it comes to web forms, humans interpret input as solid single entities. If you can, avoid select drop-downs and always prefer large buttons and toggles and sliders. When typing, let users stay on the keyboard and use autocomplete, right? Floating labels could be okay, but think about where to place them. Usually, time-wise, it's actually better to put them on the top, above the input fields, right? Not on the left and not on the right. Sometimes you can right align them. Radio buttons are round, checkboxes are squared. Well, And when it comes to single also avoid select dropdowns and maybe use steppers and data list instead. Single column layout with top aligned labels is always a safe bet, right? So you can always, get everything right in there. And then when it comes to inline validation, set thresholds, reward early, and punish late, right? Whew, I hope it wasn't too fast. What I want to leave you with is essentially, this was just a set of things that, sometimes work, sometimes don't. But I think it's really important for us to think about those things, because as we move around and we try to make better decisions in design, all these little decisions that we make in order to make our interfaces a bit better really sum up. So many forms are not accessible and really difficult to use. So much of the navigation leaves a lot of critical stuff, like really important calls to actions and products just invisible for most audiences. So this is an opportunity for us to really excel by doing little things. And so I hope that some of those things that you saw today will be helpful and help you in making your product a bit more visible and a bit more useful and accessible. With this in mind, hope that you enjoyed it. As always, from me to you, just a few more cats and now. And thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions later.